Hey everyone. Right, so I improvised this presentation this morning, so I'm going to be reading from my phone some, but I'll do a bit of an introduction at first, which I can kind of ad-lib. So yeah, so that's my name. So as described earlier, I'm a working artist, one of the very lucky few. So my wife Holly and I have a studio based in Berlin, and we produce albums. We tour those albums frequently, playing festivals and venues and such. The last record, Platform, came out a few years ago, and we toured it for about 2 years. Yeah, there's us playing a big festival in Barcelona, I think. And the thing that my mom likes is that Radiohead invited us to go on tour with them. That's the thing that I can say to people who have no familiarity with what we're doing. My mom really, really enjoyed that part. More recently, we've been experimenting with machine learning, so we're developing our own machine learning logic called Spawn, in which we are training the machine on public ceremonies, public training ceremonies. So in this particular case in Berlin most recently, we had hundreds and hundreds of people training Spawn on their collective voice that we can then use for productions. Perhaps more relevant to this context, a few years ago now, so I guess in like 2013, as an art project, I developed a framework called Saga. Now, Saga was is a decentralized publishing framework that gives an artist or a publisher the ability to track their work anywhere that it lands online. And once you see where it lands online, you are then free to express yourself through that embed as if you were there in person. So the idea of this was that if my work goes out and you place my work next to an advertisement I don't like, I should be as free to denounce it in that web space as I would be in physical space. What I think is quite interesting about Saga as an idea is this idea of saying, well, if everybody could express themselves through their work in kind of the ad-driven version of the web, would ads be able to survive that? Because obviously ads really thrive in non-contested spaces. And culture, on the opposite, kind of thrives in spaces that are highly contested. In fact, I'd argue that's probably one definition of what culture is. Through working on Saga, a bunch of people got in touch with me to say, hey, have you heard of this thing called Ethereum? They're smarter than you. So at the time, I was experimenting with what I didn't know were smart contracts, but basically this idea of kind of automating will through my work. And the people who were telling me about Ethereum were saying, hey, look, they're building this platform that will allow you to do a whole bunch of that in far, far more sophisticated and complex ways, and so I kind of caught the bug. Regarding blockchain, the things that I'm quite excited about, really, is that you see crypto as kind of this opportunity to radically rethink the way that we organize ourselves. On top of that, the idea of decentralized governance, so governance beyond borders being something particularly interesting, coming from a musical culture, which I'll get into a little bit later. The idea of being able to pull together people who all have a similar interest and have them co-manage or co-govern a network is super exciting. And this kind of group equity almost as a way to kind of save us from the, save us from the kind of Web 2 platform monopolies that are showing or displaying public utility, but as of yet have not found a better model than the ad industry to survive. And so last year, I think this is the next slide. Yeah, last year I put together a kind of petition towards SoundCloud employees when they were having trouble to say, hey, let's tokenize SoundCloud. You don't want it to go away. Musicians don't want it to go away. There's a lot of history there, not just in the music itself, but in the interactions around the music. If you guys can't figure out a better system, why not just give it to everybody and let us experiment on what the future business model might be? That obviously didn't work, but I still like the idea. Yeah, and so to go back to the Saga thing, the most enticing thing to me, that wasn't supposed to happen. That really wasn't supposed to happen. It seems to be on like auto loop. There we go. The most enticing thing to me about blockchain systems and smart contract systems specifically is this idea of encoding will into a work, right? So coming from a community that may have a particular political ideology or a particular particular objective in the world, the ability to encode uncorruptible or incorruptible will into a work seems to add a whole new capacity to the creation of an artwork and the creation of communities of artists. This is where I start reading from my phone. So yeah, crypto is an opportunity to ask ourselves, what do we want the new web to look like? For artists, what new media of expressions can be afforded by these new tools? And the arts, of course, I believe, is in dire need of these kind of conversations. Most close to me is music culture. So I specify music culture over mentioning the industry because there's very little about the old music industry that I would salvage. Perhaps beyond perhaps the tendency of people to pay for things, but you know. So music culture is something different. It's a web of local and international record labels, social spaces, publications, and political and aesthetic movements with their own idiosyncratic stories and a legacy of showing us new ways to do things. So to reference Amanda from Consensus' presentation earlier, if we are myth makers, then deep music culture and people from deep music culture are experts at myth making. A music culture was always independent of the industry and has been for as long as we've been walking on two legs. So for less than a century, an industry emerged and attempted to create a monopoly based on recorded music, and in defiance of this, through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, an independent music industry emerged that gave organic and deep musical cultures the ability to manufacture and distribute their own documentation of what they were building. So it's important to make the distinction clear. When we're talking about the major record labels, or for example, also major art or kind of centralized art authorities, many of them are simply in the business of selling music or selling art. That's kind of their function. They're selling stuff in order to be able to sell more stuff. I create the distinction with musical culture and deep arts cultures in the sense that the artifacts that are used to distribute the culture are simply a means to an end to distribute the culture. It's not about selling the artifact itself, it's about finding a means to sustain that culture. So, music culture gave us, this is the next slide, yep, Discord Records, 4AD, who we're signed to, Warp Records, Earache, these are each kind of idiosyncratic networks that meant a lot to people when they were when they were in their prime, and the aesthetic legacy of this is still milked by major artists to this day, right? So you can go on to a Spotify, for example, and see playlists talking about the golden era of electronica spawned by something like a Warp Records, or the golden era of indie rock spawned by something like a 4AD. And we are seemingly perennially caught in this kind of feedback loop of the subcultures of the 90s, because my argument is that the centralized kind of platform monopolies of today are very, very happy to borrow from this legacy, but in fact aren't contributing all that much to be able to create new legacies. So epoch-defining communities. Before the era of the internet, independent musical culture developed a wireless, near-universal peer-to-peer network of reputation systems and nomadic value exchange. So punk bands were smuggled through the Iron Curtain. I have many friends in Poland who recount stories to me of this. And grindcore bands, if any of you know what grindcore is, from my hometown in Birmingham, England, this is Napalm Death. This is the president of Indonesia wearing a Napalm Death shirt because somehow in the 80s and early 90s, despite the fact that the music at that point in time was traded through tapes and word of mouth, became a massive Napalm Death fan, which actually turned into kind of a weird political situation I have no time to get into. But kind of a great example of how decentralized peer-to-peer reputation systems, super low tech, can actually build a culture, and I think music has a deep history of that. So just as the ability to manufacture and distribute your own records helped create the independent music industry in opposition to the major labels of the time, the new tools available to us to create decentralized, self-directed, and self-governing communities on the blockchain may be able to help us seek autonomy outside of the platform monopolies of Web 2. I worry, however, that the crypto community at large is overlooking the opportunity to work with kindred spirits within the realm of the arts. So I've spent the past few years finding decision makers from all corners of independent music and arts culture who tell me the same thing. They participate in these platforms because they don't know where else to go, and they don't have the technical skills available to them to build the networks akin to the networks that they originally built. So these are pioneers. The people who built, the people who built the original independent musical networks, for example, have a track record of building alternate systems of value and exchange, and have also, over that time, cultivated an audience of characters who are risk positive and are involved in those networks because they want to see cultural change manifest. I don't think you could say the same thing for commercial radio. Let me jump through this. Yeah, small musical communities are the lifeblood of music generally. It's where the ideas come from. And under centralized power systems, those ideas trickle up. They always have. So the popular hits of yesteryear were almost always borrowing their kind of aesthetic momentum or dynamism from smaller, less visible communities. Communities you didn't see. So that record that referenced disco was, of course, inspired by this wonderful musical community happening in place. But at the time, people didn't get too fussed about that because someone putting their rather large resources behind a movement meant that money would circulate for everybody. Now, in music currently, as in Web 2 generally, the winner takes all. So 77% of revenues in music are enjoyed by the top 1% of musicians. So we are streaming toward a monocultural monarchy. The journalist Victor Luckerson even went so far as to describe the artist Drake as a monopoly that needed to be broken up by regulators. Such is his prominence in collusion with major labels and their platform collaborators. A few weeks ago, all 7 tracks on Kanye West's latest album occupied the top 7 most streamed tracks on Spotify, and the 3 records that he has his name associated with occupied the top 3 records on Apple Music, top 3 albums. So centralization of power in tech as well as in art leads to monopoly. Yet, over the past few years, when I see rare efforts from the crypto community to court musical or artistic culture, I see attempts to court and convince incumbent power structures in the arts rather than these deep communities. So in my mind, this is a huge missed opportunity. Courting major record labels and blue-chip galleries and tailoring systems for their deeply flawed and protectorate industries is the cultural equivalent of Satoshi tethering his ideas to Goldman Sachs. The major entertainment industry, for example, already extinguished one potential renaissance with the peer-to-peer protocols of the 90s, and I'm fairly sure that they'll be just as reactionary with this new suite of tools. So the arts vitally needs new and alien logics for the creation and enjoyment of works, not the fortification of bad systems with new tricks. A sympathetic reading suggests that this is an excusable mistake. Many people involved in crypto culture from early on may not have even lived through a time of abundant and independently autonomous cultural organizations before Web 2 came and flattened everything. And the platforms of today are adept to presenting a facade of support for culture, when in reality, all culture is uncomfortably curving toward their own objectives. Just as many in the public will mistakenly view central banks and legacy institutions as a source of authority, in contrast to the good news of decentralized systems of value, I'm imploring you not to make the same mistake, and to see legacy systems that briefly impose control on top of culture as the source of authority on culture. The source of authority comes from the artist, basically. So the good news is that in this city, there are numerous people of note attempting to accelerate this transition, many of whom were mentioned in Jess Holgrave's great talk earlier. So years ago, Holly and I started a crypto discussion group, which we call Guild, with the artist Lars Holdus. Oh, that was a different slide. Go on. There we go. Yeah. And that's grown to include prominent people in the arts, working both in the arts and crypto, and our plan is to transition this from kind of like a rather large discussion group to being a creative exchange of sorts, so that people in crypto who might be looking for opportunities to participate in deep culture can come to us as a decentralized group. And there are more people on this thread too. So this is Trust. Trust.support is a space in Schöneberg that has ties to the phone protocol, which is another consensus-related project. And it's a space for platform design and utopian conspiracy. New models is something that we're loosely involved with, which is a super interesting idea. Basically, a bunch of people who are very entrenched in the art world that Jess was talking about earlier. In fact, many of the people in both Guild and New Models were referenced by Jess. Their works were referenced by Jess. But New Models is a way of looking at new models of journalism and also cultural value within the art space. And I think it's quite a powerful thing. It's quite a powerful thing to see so many people who are actually thriving within these kind of incumbent art structures, turn to blockchain and turn to some of these powerful logics in the hope of building something new. This is a project that I was involved with a couple of months ago. The artist group, Medium Group of Bitnik, and a performance artist called OMSK Social Club put together the first public crypto rave. And so the idea for the crypto rave was you could mine the location, you could mine your ticket, you could mine a +1, and then once in the venue, you were airdropped different identities to perform during the duration of the party. And then, of course, Resonate, where I sit on the board, which is basically trying to create a protocol for independent musicians. Yeah. And so there's a bunch of stuff happening. I mean, my argument on this is that I do see crypto as kind of the pivotal subcultural opportunity for artists at this point in time. However, on the condition that we actually seek to use these new tools to produce new outcomes and not simply fortify bad old ideas. So yeah, thank you.
Very cool. So we have a couple questions for you. Do you want to stay on the stage?
Sure.
Also, if you guys have other questions for Matt, the Slido app for asking questions is in the menu of the TOA app, or it's at slido.com. All right. So you mentioned a couple of these brands and labels. Mm-hmm. To replicate the power of those brands, should the entity be built with blockchain from the start, or could the brand come first, or should the brand come first?
I mean, chicken or egg, right? The thing for me, and I think I didn't mention this because I was running out of time, but the thing that I find most powerful about this is I'm a very like tech positive person. I was happy to share the stage with Gollum. I'm a long-term holder. The issue for me is I'm becoming increasingly interested in cultures that have physical space. And so, in a sense, I quite like this idea of fortifying things in physical space as well as fortifying them on the blockchain and creating some kind of symbiosis between these two things. The one thing that I would say is because if you go around in Berlin, you can, and we'll get to the crypto party thing in a second, you can LARP being in the 80s because the people from the subcultures in the 80s still own that building, right?
True.
You can LARP being in the 90s, so you can go listen to techno music, which is 30, 40 years old by now, in the halls there. And so I'm mostly interested in kind of a synthesis between IRL space and online, but it can come either way.
So then let's go to the next point. The crypto party was an awesome idea. Tell us more. Maybe explain again sort of what that was.
Sure. So the crypto party came from a guild meetup. We had like a round table, and we're just speculating, being like, you know, it would be really cool if you could automate spaces. Again, similar on this idea of being interested in physical space, because that's where culture happens. And yeah, we were like, what if you could automate a space and it would have different affordances depending on the evening? What if going to a techno party and going to a hip hop party had a completely different user experience, right? So we started off on these things, and then eventually it got to the point of being like, you got to start on first principles. Can we get people to demonstrate that they are willing to work in order to access a place? And if you airdrop them stuff and instructions, will they do it? For the first public one that we did, they did both. So we'll get to the entirely different user experience in physical space later. But yeah, so it is a pretty awesome idea, and I think fundamentally, just to finish on this point, the most powerful thing I think about the crypto party ultimately is that there is actually risk involved to people running social events through centralized platform monopolies such as Facebook. There is significant risk to that. This is an unfortunate story to bring up. I had many friends die in the Oakland fire. There was a fire in an Oakland independent space a number of years ago. And all of their whereabouts and the entire network of independent spaces that was connected through them, through the publicly visible Facebook platform, were shut down by the police. People were harassed. Parents were tracked down and harassed by people on 4chan. So the idea of having safe and cryptographically secure spaces for people to experiment, I think, is of significant importance. But it's also fun, too. Yeah.
Wow, this is a cool experiment. Well, thank you so much, then.
Thank you.